Stop for a moment before dismissing this as another breaking headline. What unfolded inside Iran this week changes the entire perception of how close the regime may be to the brink. An Irgc major departed from his military installation outside Tehran in May 2026 after claiming his son was sick. He never came back. He was not the only one. Since the opening months of 2026, an increasing number of mid-level Irgc officers and technical specialists have reportedly escaped Iran through Turkey and Azerbaijan. Men who once pledged unconditional loyalty to the Islamic Republic abandoned their assignments, their compounds, their uniforms, and ultimately the country itself. One former officer, interviewed by Al-Hur under the alias Morad from an undisclosed location in Azerbaijan, described the atmosphere spreading through the organization that was once viewed as the regime's indestructible core. According to him, many officers had begun believing they were being used as exposed human shields at vulnerable facilities, while senior leadership figures and their families were quietly transferred to safer locations. Then another incident intensified the panic. Iranian state television was compromised. A recorded address from opposition figure Reza Pahlavi appeared across the regime's own broadcasting network. In the message, he openly urged Iranian military personnel to defect. Those channels exist to defend the state. Instead, they delivered a call for soldiers to walk away from it. According to Iran International, desertion levels inside some military formations have reportedly climbed close to 90%. The Irgc intelligence branch issued a warning declaring that any refusal of orders, desertion, or insubordination among military personnel would face trial and decisive punishment. Soon afterward, part of that statement disappeared from the public release. The wording was removed because officials feared the announcement itself would spread more panic. Beyond Iran's borders, additional signs emerged. Irgc clerics and regime-linked officials were photographed boarding aircraft in Abu Dhabi, bound for Toronto. Reports state that at least 700 Irgc operatives are currently residing in Canada. At the same time, Iranian authorities threatened to confiscate assets belonging to more than 100 Iranian expatriates, including actors, athletes, and journalists. The regime also submitted the names of 15 Iranians living abroad to the judiciary for property seizure proceedings. Money was moving as well. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced that American investigators had tracked senior Iranian officials transferring funds overseas. He publicly stated that these financial movements suggested some officials might be preparing to flee. This was no longer simply unrest. It was not an isolated riot. What appeared to be unfolding was the beginning of a gradual collapse. And according to many observers, May 2026 may eventually be remembered as the month when the 47-year-old Islamic Republic entered the opening stage of its final chapter. To understand the magnitude of the crisis, one number stands above all others: 574. That is the number of separate protest sites identified across Iran since the uprising started on December 28, 2025. Those demonstrations spread across 185 cities, spanning all 31 provinces of the country. No province remained untouched. No region stayed quiet. From Tehran to Mashhad, from Isfahan to Zahedan, from the Kurdish northwest to the Balochai southeast, demonstrations erupted simultaneously across the nation in a way the Islamic Republic had never experienced during its 47-year existence. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies labeled the movement the largest and most geographically widespread anti-regime uprising in the history of the Islamic Republic. The Economist described it as the biggest uprising since 2009. Longtime Iran analysts argued it represented the most significant upheaval since the 1979 revolution itself, the same revolution that originally established the current regime. What initially began as fury over economic collapse rapidly evolved into something authorities could neither contain nor redefine. The rial plunged to $144 million per US dollar on December 28th. Inflation climbed beyond 52%. Food costs spiraled upward. Fuel shortages worsened. Water became scarce. Within days, the demonstrations transformed. In Tehran, crowds gathered in Khamenei Square, named after the founder of the Islamic Republic, and shouted, "Long live the Shah." In Mashhad, protesters tore apart a massive flag of the Islamic Republic. In Kenya, demonstrators dragged down a statue of Qasem Soleimani, the Irgc commander elevated by the regime as a martyr. The same figure whose funeral procession drew millions in 2020 was pulled to the ground by angry crowds. Meanwhile, Tehran municipal workers entered the streets at night, collecting spent ammunition casings from roadways and sidewalks. The goal was not to hide evidence of gunfire itself. Officials wanted to stop protesters from using the shell casings as physical proof of the killings. The image became unforgettable. Workers crawling through dark streets gathering bullet casings while nearby hospitals suspended non-urgent admissions because they were overwhelmed with victims suffering gunshot wounds to the head and eyes. A doctor from Nishapur described the situation to foreign journalists. He said security forces had killed at least 30 people, including children. One 5-year-old child was reportedly shot while sitting in their mother's arms. The doctor explained that many injured protesters refused to enter official hospitals out of fear they would be identified and arrested. Instead, they received treatment secretly in private clinics. Hospitals are extremely chaotic, he said, patients terrified. In a darkened Tehran neighborhood known as Punak, security forces shut off street lighting to disrupt coordination among protesters. The demonstrators answered by launching fireworks and raising illuminated smartphones into the air. Witnesses described entire streets glowing from thousands of phone screens cutting through the blackout. The moment spread worldwide within hours. When authorities shut down the lights to stop a protest, and the protest responds with a sea of light, it becomes difficult to believe the movement will disappear simply because it was ordered to. On January 9, 2026, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei appeared before cameras and referred to the protesters as harmful individuals and rioters. He accused them of acting to satisfy the President of the United States. At nearly the same time, according to reports from the New York Times, Iran International, and documents allegedly obtained from inside the Supreme National Security Council and the Presidential Office, he delivered a direct instruction: crush the protests by any means necessary. Security units reportedly received orders to shoot, kill, and show no mercy. What followed became described as the deadliest 48 hours of state violence in modern history. Snipers positioned on rooftops, government buildings, police facilities, and mosques opened fire using rifles and shotguns loaded with metal pellets aimed directly at heads and torsos. DSHK heavy machine guns, weapons designed for military combat rather than crowd control, were reportedly deployed against civilian gatherings. By January 13, 2026, Iran International, citing government sources, hospital data, and testimony from physicians across the country, reported that at least 12,000 civilians had been killed during those 2 days. Subsequent investigations raised the figure to 36,500, describing it as the deadliest 2-day massacre of protesters ever recorded. Families arriving to retrieve the bodies of relatives were reportedly charged bullet fees before authorities released the remains. Some victims were falsely registered as Baas militia members in an attempt to conceal the true number of civilian deaths. At least 50,000 individuals were arrested. IRGC armed personnel allegedly entered hospitals and shot wounded protesters inside medical facilities. Then the government severed communications. Beginning on January 8th, a nationwide internet blackout isolated Iran from the outside world. It marked the third full shutdown imposed by the Islamic Republic in recent years. By this stage, Iranians had already spent more than 1/3 of 2026 disconnected from global communications, unable to contact family members, conduct business, or learn what was happening inside their own country. The authorities believed mass violence would end the uprising. It did not. The protests adapted instead. They shifted to rooftops. They moved underground. They embedded themselves into daily life. Funerals transformed into political demonstrations. Universities erupted into sit-ins. No fire festivals became acts of collective resistance. During the 40-day memorial ceremonies honoring victims of the January massacres, student-led protests spread across every major university in the country. Not one campus remained silent. For decades, the Islamic Republic operated under a single assumption central to its survival. The IRGC would always obey orders. The security forces would always hold together. The armed men would always fire outward at the population, never inward at the system itself. Events in 2019 appeared to confirm that belief. During those protests, approximately 1,500 people were killed within days, while the security structure remained intact. No major defections emerged. No large-scale desertions appeared. This time felt different. On January 9th, the IRGC intelligence organization released a statement that departed from the regime's usual messaging. Inside the statement, in a section later deleted, appeared a direct warning aimed at IRGC personnel themselves. Any refusal of orders, desertion, or disobedience would face trial and decisive punishment. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies later observed that the removal of the passage likely reflected fears of triggering panic inside the ranks. But the very existence of the warning revealed something far more serious. No government publicly warns its own soldiers about desertion unless desertion is already happening, and the available evidence suggested it was already underway. Iran International reported that within certain military formations, desertion rates climbed close to 90%. That number requires careful interpretation. It did not mean 90% of the entire IRGC abandoned their positions, but within specific units, operating under particular levels of exposure, pressure, and danger, 9 out of every 10 personnel were reportedly absent from duty. The Farda news agency stated that increasing numbers of Iranian soldiers, officers, and military officials either rejected orders outright or failed to appear for assignments. Iran's military judiciary responded with severe warnings. Authorities declared that any refusal to obey commands or any act of desertion would be treated as treason, regardless of whether the motive involved personal fear or alleged cooperation with enemies. Officials also threatened execution for Basij and security force personnel attempting to escape. At the same time, reports began documenting a growing institutional fracture inside the armed forces themselves. In March 2026, Iran International reported that tensions between the IRGC and the regular Iranian military, the Artesh, had escalated into open hostility within the command structure. According to those reports, IRGC members refused to transport wounded Artesh soldiers to hospitals, even when nearby medical facilities remained available. Regular army units reportedly endured severe battlefield losses while receiving minimal ammunition, food, and drinking water supplies. Repeated appeals for assistance were allegedly rejected by IRGC representatives. Some military formations were surviving on only one meal each day. Meanwhile, certain IRGC personnel reportedly purchased food from civilian stores using their own money after expired rations had been distributed to them. The force designed to serve as Iran's Praetorian Guard was now struggling to feed itself, while senior commanders remained protected inside secure compounds. Then came the personal unraveling. One officer at a time, one defection after another, one conscience breaking away from the organization. Beginning in January 2026, a rising wave of mid-level IRGC officers and technical specialists reportedly escaped Iran through Turkey and Azerbaijan. Iran Newswire, citing testimony from defectors, regional investigations, and independent human rights reporting, portrayed an organization increasingly damaged by internal suspicion, economic hardship, and fear of internal purges. Officers described a growing divide between senior commanders who relocated their families to safer areas and ordinary personnel left stationed at exposed military sites. For ethnic Azeri officers, Azerbaijan represented both cultural familiarity and a political environment becoming increasingly hostile toward Tehran. For many others, Turkey became the principal transit corridor. The country's large Iranian diaspora population and established migration channels reportedly made it easier for defectors to disappear and seek asylum. Exiled opposition figure Raza Pahlavi announced that more than 20,000 members of Iran's military had contacted his office through an online registration system expressing interest in defecting. Even if the number contained exaggeration, the broader direction appeared unmistakable. Former U.S. intelligence officer Michael Pregent, speaking with Iran International, described what he believed had been lost. There was a moment, he said, referring to the 12 days of Israeli and U.S. military strikes. The regime was on the run. People were watching closely. There was momentum. According to Pregent, individuals who may have defected ultimately found themselves with nowhere to go. The issue was no longer whether defections inside the IRGC existed. The real question was whether those defections would eventually reach the critical threshold that history has repeatedly shown can bring down governments. Analysts studying Iran's own 1979 revolution have often pointed to one decisive factor. When security services stop firing on their own population, when soldiers begin recognizing themselves in the protesters standing before them, regimes collapse. That was what happened to the General Mara Karlan, a defense advisor in the Biden administration, described this as the primary indicator she monitored closely. As of March 11th, however, she stated that large-scale defections had not yet materialized. Still, she was watching carefully. So was everyone else. It is one thing when ordinary troops desert. It is something entirely different when senior figures within the regime quietly prepare their own escape routes. In January 2026, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent delivered a statement carrying major implications. He announced that American authorities had tracked Iranian officials transferring funds overseas. He said he interpreted those financial movements as evidence that some were preparing to leave the country. Senior Iranian officials were reportedly moving money abroad, constructing financial escape plans, and preparing for life after the regime. Such behavior did not resemble leadership fully convinced of victory. Additional reports surfaced describing IRGC-linked mullahs and regime officials departing Iran for Western countries. One documented case involved a mullah photographed boarding a flight from Abu Dhabi to Toronto, Canada. Canadian Member of Parliament Melissa Lantsman, who had spent years warning about IRGC activities in Canada, publicly stated that at least 700 IRGC operatives were residing inside the country. She accused IRGC agents of conducting domestic terrorism operations in Canada while working on behalf of the Iranian government. She also claimed Canadian authorities were aware of their presence and allowed them to remain. The Conservative Treehouse, along with multiple Canadian media outlets, reported a broader pattern of IRGC-connected individuals quietly relocating to Western cities through migration networks, diaspora connections, and in certain cases, government-issued permits granted despite official IRGC inadmissibility policies. The regime reacted to these departures by intensifying threats against dissidents already living abroad. the Islamic Republic announced it would pursue critics both inside and outside Iran through property seizures, arrests, and death sentences. On March 21st, Iran's intelligence ministry submitted documents concerning 15 Iranians living overseas to the judiciary for review tied to asset confiscation proceedings. On April 5th, Tehran's prosecutor ordered the identification and seizure of funds held in bank accounts belonging to more than 100 Iranian expatriates, including actors, athletes, and journalists affiliated with Iran International and Minoto. The government attempted to weaponize financial destruction against critics abroad, even while its own officials quietly transferred wealth out of the country. Journalists working for Iran International in London reportedly received threats considered so credible that British authorities carried out multiple arrests involving suspected Iranian intelligence operatives on UK territory. On March 19th, British authorities arrested 2 suspected Iranian spies near a nuclear submarine base in Scotland. The European Union sanctioned the commander of Unit 840 within the Irgc's force over allegations that he ordered assassination operations targeting journalists critical of the Islamic Republic. The same regime threatening critics overseas was simultaneously losing its own personnel from within. The men who constructed the system were now preparing contingency plans in case it failed. As Iran descended deeper into internal crisis, the international response from the Iranian diaspora reached a level never seen before. On February 14th, 2026, Valentine's Day, deliberately selected as a symbol of solidarity and love for the Iranian people, Raza Pahlavi announced a worldwide day of action. Iranians across Europe, North America, and other regions gathered in cities including Los Angeles, Toronto, and Munich. More than 250,000 people attended the Munich rally, which organizers and attending media described as the largest Iran-focused demonstration ever held in Europe. The Toronto gathering drew 350,000 participants. Los Angeles also recorded 350,000 attendees. Iranians traveled by car, bus, and airplane from neighboring states, nearby cities, across Europe and throughout North America to stand together in Western streets and speak publicly about the situation facing relatives back home. The slogans displayed during the demonstrations revealed a politically complex movement. The message was not simply death to the mullahs. It was not merely support for restoring monarchy either. Signs carried statements such as, "No Shah, no mullahs," "Yes to a democratic republic." Others declared, "A dictator is a dictator, whether with a turban or crown." Another slogan read, "From Zahedan to Tan, down with the oppressor, whether the Shah or the supreme leader." The language reflected a generation deeply familiar with its political history, conscious of what it wanted, and unwilling to exchange one form of authoritarianism for another. Thousands of Iranians living in Australia submitted a parliamentary petition requesting that the Australian government revoke recognition of the Islamic Republic. Petitioners argued that most Iranians no longer viewed the regime as their legitimate representative. Thousands of Iranian Canadians filed a petition before the Canadian House of Commons demanding that the Islamic Republic be classified as a foreign occupying entity lacking domestic legitimacy. Iranian American communities organized rallies throughout major U.S. cities. In London, demonstrators called on the UK government to designate the Irgc as a terrorist organization, a measure the European Union had already implemented in February. The diaspora had become more than a political movement. It evolved into a communications network, a financial support structure, and an intelligence relay system. Whenever the regime shut down internet access inside Iran, the diaspora stepped in to receive smuggled footage, translate it, amplify it, and deliver it to international media organizations and diplomatic institutions. The Starlink satellite internet network, unreachable by Iran's domestic shutdown systems, enabled Iranians inside the country to remain connected with the outside world. Every protest video, every documented massacre, every rooftop chant, every body outside a hospital eventually reached the outside world somehow. The regime could sever cables, but it could not shut down the sky. Empires do not collapse only through military defeat. They collapse when the narratives sustaining them stop being trusted, even by the people assigned to repeat them. In February 2026, an Iranian state television reporter appeared to say, "Death to Calm" live on air during coverage of the annual anniversary rally marking the Islamic Revolution. The station director was dismissed afterward, but the significance was not the firing itself. It was the fact that the statement happened at all. It reached broadcast. It remained on air long enough for viewers to notice before anyone interrupted it. That moment pointed to something much deeper. The regime's media structure no longer appeared completely loyal. State television later carried another shock. Either the network's own signal was compromised internally, or an outside operation seized control of it. Across the state broadcaster's channels, viewers suddenly saw Raza Pahlavi delivering a direct appeal urging military personnel to defect. Iranian state television also announced 240 forced confessions. For decades, forced confessions served as a psychological weapon during every major protest wave, designed to break morale and demonstrate government dominance. But needing 240 confessions revealed something else entirely. It exposed the size of the crisis authorities were attempting to contain. Then the fractures became public inside state-aligned media itself. The outlet Tasnim published an editorial arguing that Iran's negotiating approach toward the United States lacked realism. The article compared demands for the removal of all sanctions before talks to expecting a magical beanstalk. Hardline publication Raja News answered with fury, accusing Tasnim of spreading division and assisting Trump's objectives inside Iran. Tasnim deleted the editorial and claimed it had mistakenly reposted material from another source, but the conflict did not end there. Tasnim responded aggressively, accusing Raja News of behavior harmful to national security. The outlet also referenced recent arrests connected to suspicious activities allegedly intended to undermine sacred unity. Iran's own state-connected media organizations had entered open conflict with one another, inside a system where every outlet is expected to deliver a single, unified message. This was no ordinary disagreement. It was a visible crack. Then another moment unfolded, live on television. A state television anchor named Elmira Sharifi looked directly into the camera during a live broadcast and asked, "What is going on in this country, Mr. Peskian?" A year earlier, such a question from a government-employed presenter on state television would have been unimaginable. The fact that she asked it, that nobody stopped her, that the exchange aired publicly, and that it continued circulating afterward, demonstrated how severely the Islamic Republic's ability to project coherent authority had weakened. Still, precision matters more than exaggeration. As of May 2026, the Islamic Republic of Iran had not collapsed. The IRGC remained largely operational. The security apparatus still functioned. Official U.S. intelligence assessments stated that the regime was not facing immediate collapse and continued maintaining control over the Iranian population. An Al-Hura analysis posed the central question directly. How was the Iranian regime still standing? The answer was sobering. A government capable of killing more than 30,000 of its own citizens during 2 days in January, while keeping the nation disconnected from the internet for more than one-third of 2026, was never likely to permit genuine dissent to emerge uncontested. When the conflict began in February, the IRGC appeared on state television referencing the January 8th and 9th crackdowns directly, promising an even harsher response than what occurred on January 8th. Officials warned parents that children participating in demonstrations or cooperating with enemies could face death. Besieged checkpoints rapidly appeared across TAN and provincial cities. The repression machinery did not slow after the bombing campaign started. It intensified. 3 structural realities explain why the regime continued surviving. Despite its fractures and defections, the IRGC expanded its role in domestic affairs after the war began, ensuring the system remained operational even without effective civilian leadership. Its decentralized command network, reorganized by Ali Larijani before his death into autonomous regional headquarters, allowed the structure to continue functioning even if senior leadership figures were removed or incapacitated, and the physical infrastructure of control remained intact. Surveillance systems, prison networks, execution courts, the neighborhood presence of the Basijis. None of it had been dismantled, but surviving structurally is not the same as possessing legitimacy, and the forces that historically destroy regimes were accumulating faster than at any moment since 1979. Historians, intelligence officials, and Iran specialists repeatedly point to the same decisive factor determining regime survival: the security forces. Analysts examining the 1979 revolution note that when security personnel refused to shoot civilians, the Shah collapsed within weeks. The weapons stopped pointing at crowds. Everything changed afterward. Iran's revolution succeeded not because of protest numbers alone, because of what happened inside the military itself. Now, in May 2026, the IRGC intelligence organization had publicly warned personnel about desertion and later removed the warning. Some units were reportedly approaching desertion levels near 90%. Officers continued escaping through Turkey and Azerbaijan. Senior officials moved money overseas. More than 20,000 military personnel reportedly contacted the opposition's defection platform. Iran's own president reportedly warned generals that they were steering the nation toward an enormous catastrophe. Every week, the distance between a regime still standing and a regime still structurally healthy grew wider. The Islamic Republic had not yet collapsed, but it was becoming hollow. And hollow systems often do not fail gradually. One military defeat, one economic shock too severe to absorb, one highly visible unit refusing orders in one major city. That can become the moment everything falls at once. Through the massacres, the internet shutdowns, the defections, the propaganda failures, the fleeing mullahs, the overseas money transfers, The 72% yearly inflation, the empty ATMs, and hospitals overflowing with gunshot victims, the Iranian people continued telling the world exactly what they wanted. They shouted it from rooftops in darkness. They carried it through the streets of Munich, Toronto, and Los Angeles with 250,000 voices. They expressed it through university sit-ins and student protests. It appeared in letters, smuggled out of Evin prison by imprisoned writers and delivered to PN America, describing systematic repression, extreme poverty, executions, nationwide protests, and the suffering endured by families seeking justice for victims of state violence. It appeared in petitions submitted by Iranian Australians and Iranian Canadians to the parliaments of their adopted countries. It appeared on signs declaring no dictator with a turban and no dictator with a crown. Yes, to a democratic republic. A young woman named Raha Bulipur was shot and killed near Fatmi Square in Tehran on January 8, 2026. She loved art and music. She was not an organizer, not a public figure, not part of a political faction. She was simply a young Iranian woman walking through her own city. Iranian security forces killed her, but the movement she became part of, the movement existing before her death and continuing afterward, grew larger after she was gone. For 47 years, the Islamic Republic attempted convincing Iranians that it ruled through divine authority, that resistance represented foreign-backed treason, that the security apparatus could never be challenged, and that the outside world did not care. Every one of those claims was now being challenged. For the people marching in the streets, the movement carried its own sense of purpose. In their eyes, the resistance was Iranian at its core. Security personnel were deserting, and the world from Munich to Washington to CRA was paying attention. On December 28, 2025, a shopkeeper in Thrawn closed his business and stepped into the street. 5 months later, Iran's supreme leader was reportedly hiding in an undisclosed location and communicating through written notes. The president could not control the military. The foreign minister was reportedly taking direction from the Irgc rather than the elected government. The economy was collapsing under 71% annual inflation, while oil income fell to only 5% of the national budget. Soldiers were deserting in the thousands. Mid-ranking Irgc officers continued escaping through Turkey and Azerbaijan. Mullahs boarded flights heading toward Toronto. Senior officials transferred money abroad. State media organizations publicly attacked one another. A state television anchor questioned the president live on air about what was happening to the country. The protest movement expanded to 574 locations across all 31 provinces. More than 20,000 military personnel reportedly contacted opposition networks, expressing interest in defecting. More than 250,000 people marched in Munich. 350,000 gathered in Toronto and Los Angeles. Reza Pahlavi's government-in-waiting continued building infrastructure. The diaspora mobilized. The world watched closely. The Islamic Republic of Iran had not collapsed. It was in the process of collapsing. There is a difference. That difference is measured in how rapidly the hollow spreads, how deep the fractures become, and when one more unit in one more city refuses one more order. And when that moment arrives, whether in weeks, months, or longer, the people who made it possible will not be foreign governments, military campaigns, or intelligence services. They will be the Iranians who shouted from rooftops in darkness, the people who raised glowing phone screens when the power went out, the soldiers who walked away from their bases and never returned, the prisoners who wrote letters from Evin prison, the marchers who gathered thousands of miles from home to show the world their country was not alone. History is unfolding inside Iran right now. Stay connected for the next chapter as events continue to develop.